Welcome to the first video on my channel. My name is Synthwave, and tonight we're going to be diving into some facts about the original RE trilogy 1, 2, and 3. In Japan, Resident Evil was never called Resident Evil. It was called Biohazard, and still is to this day. Trademark drama. Capcom tried to bring Biohazard to the US in 1994 and hit a wall. Turns out there was already a random DOS game called Biohazard, and a New York hardcore band with the same name. No way to trademark it. So, Capcom USA did what any reasonable company does, held a company-wide naming contest. Employees pitched ideas and Resident Evil won, a pun on the fact that the whole first game takes place in one giant mansion with evil residents. In 2017, RE7's official Western title is Resident Evil Biohazard, so you could say it's Biohazard Biohazard. Resident Evil almost came to the Game Boy Color, and someone just proved it was nearly finished. Back in the late 1990s, British developer HotGen was tasked with porting the original Resident Evil from PlayStation to the Game Boy Color. Reportedly, they managed to squeeze in most of the core experience from the console versions. Shinji Mikami personally pushed for its cancellation, stating that he didn't believe the Game Boy Color was worthy of the franchise. In December 2025, a near-complete 98% build of the cancelled ports surfaced online, containing content never seen before, including the Tyrant, the game's ending, and it was believed to be fully playable from start to finish. One of Resident Evil's most disturbing enemies wasn't just a monster, it started out as a human being. The Chimera was a human-fly hybrid bioweapon developed by Umbrella in the Arclay laboratory, created by grafting fly DNA into human embryos. A Japanese exclusive guidebook reveals the first chimeras were grown inside the wombs of homeless women that Umbrella kidnapped and forcibly impregnated with the mutated eggs. They matured quickly, but their physiology was underdeveloped, lacking a proper exoskeleton, exposed bones and vitals visible through their torsos, and intelligence no greater than that of a fly. Despite having wings, they were too small and underdeveloped to allow flight, but their multi-jointed limbs let them crawl through air ducts and drop down on unsuspecting prey from the ceiling. Before Resident Evil, Capcom made a horror game you've probably never heard of. Sweet Home was a 1989 Famicom RPG set in a haunted mansion, and Resident Evil began as a remake of it, borrowing the mansion setting, inventory management, puzzles, and even the iconic door opening loading screens. One forgotten Famicom game quietly built the foundation for an entire genre. In the original 1996 Resident Evil, if you picked Chris Redfield, you were picking hard mode. Chris can only carry 6 items in total, while Jill can carry 8. Instead of having a lockpick, Chris has to hunt down keys just to open doors and drawers, while Jill can just go straight in. Less inventory, harder enemies, and slower access to things meant that Chris Redfield was the hard mode of Resident Evil 1. One of the most iconic lines in Resident Evil was an accident. When saving Jill from a trap, Barry tells Jill, "You were almost a Jill sandwich." This goofy line was born from the game's very rough English localization. While at the time people didn't think much of it, it has since become a meme decades after it released. Resident Evil 1 was remade in 2002. With it, they added one mechanic to surprise those that might have thought the game too easy. If a zombie isn't decapitated or burned after being killed, you'll be surprised when that zombie revives. They come back as faster, deadlier Crimson Heads. This makes the player have to decide both when and where to use the limited amount of kerosene. The result of this was that when players backtracked, they would be ambushed by a Crimson Head mid-hallway. The 2002 Resident Evil remake added a tragic boss, notable by fans who say she is emotionally scary rather than mechanically. Lisa Trevor, a daughter of the same architect who built the Spencer Mansion, she was unfortunately kept alive and experimented on by the Umbrella scientists for decades. They exposed her to virus after virus, causing her body to mutate and eventually becoming a near-invincible monster. Wearing the face of her own mother, she was planned for the original game, but got cut. In Resident Evil, nobody was yawning because they were tired. In fact, there is a giant snake-like boss called Yawn, brutally mutated, and the way it strikes is by stretching its mouth wide open and lashing out. Just like a yawn. Originally just one of the snakes chilling out in the forest, it was taken in as a research specimen and infected with the T-virus, becoming the game's first boss fight. If you have a degree in chemistry, a certain boss fight can be bypassed easily. In Resident Evil 1, Jill can mix the V-Gel solution. She can expose this to Plant 42's roots right before entering the boss's room, skipping the fight entirely. Chris doesn't get this luxury. Even though he has Rebecca to make the V-Gel, he still has to fight Plant 42, albeit slightly easier. The original Resident Evil 2 was almost a totally different experience. It would have featured a biker named Eliza Walker instead of the Claire Redfield you know today, though still alongside Leon Kennedy. This version reached around 80% completion before Capcom restarted development from scratch. Producer Shinji Mikami scrapped it, citing the quality wasn't reaching what he wanted in time. He also felt the locations and gameplay were dull. This is what fans now dub as Resident Evil 1.5. Why does the RPD in Resident Evil 2 look the way it does? It doesn't look like a police station. The RPD headquarters was originally the Raccoon Art Museum. It was converted into a police station in the late 1980s. However, during renovation, several of the museum features were left untouched. The giant goddess statue in the main hall, the most obvious leftover. Chief Irons was an art sculptor enthusiast. He had personally brokered the building's purchase, which explains why the police station is the way it is. Leon Kennedy was almost killed in Resident Evil 2. Thanks to a bad breakup, he was saved. Capcom's own Canon material confirms that Leon managed to avoid the fate of his fellow officers. Purely by chance, he would show up late on his first day. He got drunk the night before thanks to his girlfriend breaking up with him. Not sure if missing a first day is ever good, but I guess this time it saved Leon's life and thrust the franchise into the mainstream. This weird and grotesque enemy of Resident Evil 2 freaked out players. The Licker is a secondary mutation of the zombies, identifiable by exposed and expanded brain, lack of skin and eyes, and extreme sensitivity to sound. They gain claws and a very gross barbed tongue, which can pierce its prey. The survivors inside the police station actually named it themselves. Officer David Ford and the others called it a Licker on the account of its very gross tongue. The police chief of the RPD seemed incompetent, or was he? Chief Irons was actually taking bribes and secretly working for Umbrella, specifically to keep the company out of their investigations. On the 25th of September, he went crazy and ordered the weapons locker to be emptied, including hiding ammunition throughout the building, ensuring his officers die. Not only was he corrupt, but in the end, mentally unstable. Mr. X, the T-00 was one of 6 tyrants flown into Raccoon City. It had 2 unique missions: eliminate any survivors of the Raccoon City police station and recover a sample of the G-virus. Specifically, he was to find the pendant worn by a young girl named Sherry Birkin. Chasing you through the RPD and making the main hall a not-so-safe room, he personally terrified me on many occasions. You might think Leon Kennedy is a hunk, but you've never seen a hunk before. In the original Resident Evil 2, players, upon beating both Claire and Leon scenarios with A ranks, unlock a secret 4th survivor. This is the bonus mode starring an operative from Umbrella, named Hunk. Unlike most minigames, this one is actually canon to the story. Hunk's real nickname is the Grim Reaper, in Japanese. Mistranslations across the series turned it into Mr. Death. Resident Evil 2 featured a big fat alligator in the sewers. It can be killed in one shot if you know the trick. There is an emergency gas canister nearby, which you can release. The alligator can scoop it up in its mouth, and if you shoot it, it will explode its head. Pretty satisfying if you can do it right. There actually is a canon order to play Resident Evil 2, and it only took 14 years to confirm. If you guessed Claire A and then followed by Leon B, you would be correct, though this wasn't actually confirmed until Resident Evil 6 in 2012. A small piece of dialogue that Sherry relays only makes sense if she was infected the same way she would have been in Claire A and Leon B. While not 100% clean, there are other details from the reverse order that can get referenced too, so technically speaking, canon can be a blend of both routes. The Resident Evil 3 that you know today almost wasn't Resident Evil 3 at all. What started as a low-budget, untitled PS1 spin-off game was dubbed as Resident Evil 199. It was meant to fill the gap while the proper next-generation sequel was being developed, but it got promoted into a mainline entry game about 3 months before its deadline. So, in my opinion, it's one of the best of the original trilogy. The proper next-generation sequel they did end up developing had actually turned into something else entirely. It became Devil May Cry. The original Resident Evil 3 was scrapped before Nemesis even existed. Capcom was actually developing Biohazard 3, starring our very own Hunk. He was tasked with hunting down a G-virus sample during an outbreak on the cruise ship. However, Sony had announced the PlayStation 2 at the time, so Capcom decided not to risk releasing a game right as a new console launched. Now, a gap had been left in their lineup, but fortunately, our favorite would-be spin-off was promoted to the mainline series. This is what we would now know as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil 3 takes place around the same time as Resident Evil 2. You can have a prequel, you can have a sequel, now you have a midquel. The first half of the game takes place 24 hours before Resident Evil 2 even begins. The second half picks up right after it ends, following Jill's parallel escape through the very same outbreak. Carlos even spends half of the gap searching for a cure inside the hospital, just a few streets away from the RPD. Nemesis was unfortunately not just a mindless monster, he actually had a hit list. Umbrella actually deployed Nemesis to specifically hunt down and kill the member of the Stars. This included Jill, so that nobody could expose the company's bioweapons program. He could actually pursue players through the different areas using his gross tentacles. He grappled and intercept their paths so he could jump back into view. Resident Evil 3 had a QuickTime event feature, though they referred to this as the live selection feature. It would prompt players to choose between two possible actions on the fly. Picking wrong could lead to death or a boss fight. However, this really only created an illusion of choice, considering that there were only two endings to the game. Its main goal was to create tense moments more than it was active consequences. Resident Evil 3 introduced us to something new, Jill Valentine's epic dodging skills and agile movement abilities. All this just to have a slim chance against fighting Nemi. The game finally introduced a dodge mechanic to avoid and repel enemy attacks, in addition to a full 180-degree turn, which allowed the player to make a quick getaway. With practice and insane skills, players could actively run circles around old Nemi using these mechanics. Resident Evil 3 marked the end to Raccoon City. At least 100,000 people were infected, and uninfected alike were killed. The US government sneakily sent a thermobaric weapon to the city, second only to a nuclear bomb. The effects of this attack is felt into the distant future. The ninth game in the franchise, Requiem, takes Leon Kennedy back to the city where players can see the destruction and desolation firsthand. There are some really crazy Resident Evil fans. These players would replay Resident Evil 3 over and over. However, they were actually rewarded for their efforts. Each time the player beat the game on hard mode, a brand new epilogue visual appeared in the credits. In total, this covered Jill, Chris, Barry, Leon, Claire, Sherry, Ada, and Hunk. Claire's epilogue specifically set up her search for Chris, leading into her story for the Code Veronica game. Resident Evil 3 was a very fashionable game for its time, for both the PlayStation and GameCube versions. There were 5 unlockable costumes for Jill. These included her classic Stars uniform, a biker outfit, a disco suit, and a casual look. All you have to do is replay the game. Just beating the game on easy with the passing rank unlocks 2 of them right away. The rest, however, demand the spectacular A rank with no saves, meaning no mistakes. One of Resident Evil 3's most iconic locations barely survived its own remake. In the original game, Jill and Carlos end up at a clock tower after their tram crashes, meaning they needed to solve puzzles, fight little Nemi, and deal with Jill's T-Virus infection. It was actually a fully explorable area. In the remake, however, while not technically removed completely, the player only visits the front of the tower for a boss fight. Unfortunately, it was cut during the remake's development and left a sour taste in players' mouths. Fans noted that it made the remake game way shorter in comparison and somewhat rushed. Resident Evil 3 didn't just have silly crazy zombies in it, it also had drained demos, which were tiny little fleas that mutated into big monster. By sucking the blood of zombies during the outbreak, these fellas cling to walls and ceilings to feed on victims' brain fluid, which is kinda gross. Meanwhile, there are also big spiders that mutated from leaked T-Virus into the sewers. These produced tiny offspring that would attack you. They would always try to take you by surprise. In Resident Evil 3, fighting Nemesis instead of running from him is actually the smarter strategy, and most players never figured that out. In the original game, on hard mode, every time you down Nemesis during his stalking encounters, he drops a supply case containing powerful weapon upgrades, parts for the Eagle handgun, parts for the M37 shotgun, and even a first aid spray case holding 3 sprays at once. 7 total encounters and 7 potential rewards. Most players' instinct is to run the moment Nemesis appears, which is exactly what Capcom expected and what I did. The item drops were a reward for the brave few willing to stand and fight the thing that was hunting them. And that's enough Resident Evil for now. If you enjoyed this, then feel free to hit that thumbs up button right at the bottom of the video, and if you want more of this content, feel free to subscribe.